Today we're going to be reading through one of these original texts where he interprets and explains a passage from the Zohar. Now I have the book right over here, but I'm going to be doing a screen share. It's a pretty thick book. This is just one of them. There's many such books and with lots of pages on this kind of information. In fact, this specific discourse has an entire book just explaining these 4 or 5 pages, which we are going to be studying today. So it's very cool. We're going to be studying it from the inside of the original. And this discourse, which we're going to be reading today, describes and explains a passage from the Zohar. This passage from the Zohar is said by Elijah, where he's speaking about God and explaining how there are the 10 Sefirot and many spiritual levels, and really just describing pretty much the whole chain of Kabbalah. So in today's discourse, we will be covering the soul. And in the soul, we're going to be covering 3 aspects. We have the essence of the soul, which is its true self, its components and abilities, which are actually the Sefirot, which we're going to be learning all about. And we're going to be seeing that the soul is a distinct being from its abilities, its Sefirot. So us as humans, we can think, we can feel. Those are additions, abilities that we have in addition to our essence. And then we'll see how they operate in our bodies. You can see this in the description of this video right below. And the second aspect, which we're going to be talking about, is spirituality and heavenly realms, using the understanding of the soul that we have just previously learned about. We haven't learned it yet. We're going to be learning about in the discourse. We will be able to understand the spiritual worlds and the Sefirot, how the heavenly realms operate. And then we're going to get deeper into that. We're going to be studying about exactly how these heavenly realms work. We're going to be learning about a concept called Tzimtzum, the removal of God's infinity from the space of this universe, and how we relate to spirituality, how that infinity of God's spiritual worlds comes into this. So now, without any further ado, I'm going to go. A few disclaimers. In this class, rather than focusing on the translation, we will be actually highlighting. This class will highlight the explanations, metaphors, and analogies which best convey these ideas. These are very deep ideas, and if we're going to focus too much on the translations, we might get a little confused. So we're going to be focusing on the explanation and how this makes sense. Another little disclaimer I wanted to make before we start we're going to be speaking about heavenly realms, spirituality. Now, the word heaven is, so to speak, above. So this is a big disclaimer. Anytime we use the word before or higher in this class, if we're talking about spiritual worlds, it is not to be taken literally. It's simply ways for us to express these ideas that transcend our understanding. And what it really means is, when we say before, it means that something is, so to speak, deeper within godly reality. The same is for above and higher. If something is higher than something else, that means it's simply more spiritual, more connected to God. There is more spiritual godliness shining within it. And without any further ado, let us begin straight away in this original Lashon HaKodesh discourse. So as we said before, this is a passage. We are in New York City, so you're going to be hearing some police cars or ambulances from time to time. So this is Eliyahu, Pasach Eliyahu, Antu Chad V'Chushban. This is Eliyahu describing or speaking about God. So he says, God, you are one and not part of the calculation. Again, we're not going to be focusing on the translations. We're going to be focusing on the explanation of what these things really mean. Antu da pikas asar tikunin. You are the one that made 10 tikunin. We're going to be describing what exactly that tikunin thing is. And now we are going to be talking about the soul's essence versus its abilities. So, lahavin inyan ze lama nikra eses firis b'shem tikunin. Why exactly what Eliyahu Hanavi, what Elijah just said, is he said that God is the one that created, that from him came 10 Sefirot, but he used the word tikunin. What exactly is tikunin? Now, the literal translation refers to clothing, garments, and we're going to be seeing why exactly we're using the word garments to describe the 10 Sefirot. We first need to understand what exactly is the essence of the soul. The soul itself is a simple and pure infinite energy or light, an expression, an infinite spiritual expression, which is without any intellect or feelings. It's simply independent and real on its own. The intellect and understanding, every being can understand and feel itself in relation to other things. These are additions to the soul. We're speaking over here about the soul. The essence of the soul is an independent being to itself, and then it uses intellect and feelings to relate to things outside of it, and therefore they are like garments. The soul, so to speak, wears these things or uses them in order to connect and express to things outside of its essence. The soul does have intellect and understanding. They are not the essence of the soul. We're going to be skipping this parentheses, which is a bit of a description, and we're going to be covering it a bit later, as we will see. So, logic and understanding that the soul uses are like these garments, which the soul, essence of the soul. We're also going to be skipping any verses which are brought as sources from other places, so we don't get confused and sidetracked. Vinyana tikkun, what is this word tikkunin? This clothing is milashon tachshit, which means a piece of jewelry. So when a person wears a piece of jewelry or a very nice piece of clothing, it makes them nicer, it makes you more presentable. So we understand from this that a piece of clothing, something which we wear, something which we put onto us, it's true that it is something that, it says something about us personally, and it's connected to us and it expresses us, but it is something external. Now we're going to be talking about, so till now we were speaking about how the soul has in its spiritual reality, logic and understanding. Now we're going to be talking about how the soul comes into our physical body, not as the soul is in a spiritual sense, but as the soul gives us life in this body. So that is something we're really going to be able to relate to. So our soul is intrinsically connected with our body and controls every single part of our body, similar to how a person wears clothing, and everything we have, which we're wearing, is connected to us and expresses how we are. So too the soul connects with the body, comes into the body, and controls the body without a problem. You want to move your hand, it immediately moves. If you want to flick your finger, anything which you want to do with your fingers, they immediately listen, because the soul is intertwined and connected with our body. And that it also applies to our feet to walk. It doesn't take lots of contemplation and thought. Immediately, the moment that we are inspired to walk, we're going to start walking. Because if it would have been a problem of contemplation, he continues and says, so if it would have been something that we need to train our body to do, if the soul and the body were completely two different things, then the soul would have needed to convince the body, come on, move your finger. But the soul doesn't need to do that. The body immediately listens. Why does the body immediately listen? Because they are connected. The soul controls the body in a form of connection. So the soul can control the body, even though the body and the soul are two completely distinct things. But the soul can control the body as if it is itself. We move our hands around, we do everything. We're using energy of our soul. We're using the will of our soul. Our willpower comes from our soul. The fact that we can want something, everything comes from our soul. That spiritual energy, and it feels just like this is what we are. This is me. This is who I am. So here we see that the soul and the body really become one, even though the body is an additional thing from the soul and something separate from the soul. So now we're going to go back into the spirituality of the soul. We're going to imagine the soul as it is on its own, so to speak, before it's giving any life to a human body. So we can also understand that the soul has within it the abilities for logic and feelings. How does the soul relate to God, which is, so to speak, above it and beyond it? Through understanding, through receiving that infinity into itself from God. And how does it experience God? Through feeling it in its feelings. These are things which the soul can do as a spiritual being. But even those are not the essence of the soul. And that's exactly what he's going to be saying over here. They are rak b'chinas tikunim v'levushin sha'nefesh mistakenes u'mislabeshes b'hen v'en kli ha'nefesh b'hen v'al yadin p'elis ha'nefesh k'garzein b'yad ha'choytzev. So the soul only uses its logic and understanding as like an axe in the hands of a chopper, somebody chopping. How exactly does that happen? To love with love and to understand with wisdom. The soul itself is completely beyond its abilities of expressing itself and understanding and feeling anything. We can see that feelings and understanding are additions to the essence of the soul. And how do we see that? Because when the soul comes into our bodies, these things are affected by our bodies. We see that when we're children, we don't have the same feelings and emotions as we do when we get older. We don't understand things the way we do as we do when we get older. We become smarter, we're interested in more abstract things, and we appreciate them. And because we see that logic and understanding are affected by our experiences in our body, obviously these are not the essence of our soul. We see that logic changes when we get older. The essence of the soul is not like that. The essence of the soul does not change at all. It remains a pure essence forever. So it's only the expression of the soul. In other words, the external aspects of the soul, which are affected by the changes that happen in our bodies. And now I see in my note over here that I wrote that we're going to be talking about how despite these abilities of the soul, understanding and feeling, despite them being like garments, they are internal and part of the way the soul operates itself. So it's not the essence. The soul uses them. They are not totally separate from the soul itself, as are so there are things which we can consider absolute garments, things which are totally external. And that would be like when we think and speak, and that is limited in time and space. The power of logic and feelings itself is not limited by time and space. But when we think it and experience it in our human body, that is limited by time and space. And that is something which is completely external to the soul, completely external. The power of logic and of feeling, they are more connected to the soul. So with that, we conclude the discussion about the soul. And now we're going to be going into the spiritual world. So we just described the soul. If you have any questions right now, please put them in the chat. If there is something you'd like to ask about the nature of the soul and its relationship with the body or with its abilities of logic and emotions, this is what we've spoken about till now. Now we're going to be going into the spiritual worlds. All right, so here I put a little number 2, and that is actually, I was going to give another little introduction before we started, but I didn't. So over here we're going to have paragraphs. The first one, we're going to be talking about the soul and its abilities, which is going to be the key to understanding the spiritual worlds, which is what we're going to be speaking about in the rest of this discourse. As we see over here, in number 2, we're going to be exploring the spiritual realms based on the understanding that we just learned in the soul. And then in number 3, we're going to explain that just as the soul is something, a being, an independent being, which is completely infinite and beyond, so too God is completely infinite and beyond. And we're also going to start exploring the 4 worlds of Kabbalah, and we're going to get into that and explain so everybody can understand what exactly we're talking about. Then we're going to explain how exactly do we come from God to these limited worlds. How exactly, if we would ask the same question in the soul, how exactly does the soul, which is an infinite, pure being and independent on its own, have these abilities of logic and understanding? Why would it be specifically logic and understanding? Why can't the soul just have things done? So they're obviously something which is kind of external and specific. Why would we choose logic and understanding out of something infinite? So in order for that to happen, there's a concept called Tzimtzum, which we mentioned right in the beginning about for God's infinity. It needs to be removed from the space of reality in order to start bringing reality. We're going to be talking about that and explaining that at somewhat depth. And then we're going to explain how these infinite abilities take form in the world, in this world. We're going to explain how, despite the fact that God is beyond these abilities, these 10 Sefirot, just like the soul is completely beyond its logic and its understanding, so too God is completely beyond his abilities, but we're still going to see that God is unified and one, indivisible from his abilities. And then we're going to explore the 10 Sefirot. Now, let's get into number 2. So over here, we're going to start speaking about these spiritual worlds based off the understanding that we just had in the soul. So now we're going to understand also, some of you might recall right over here, right in the beginning, the first line, there was a question. Why exactly are the 10 Sefirot called garments? That was the question. And then we started explaining, first we need to understand the soul. So now we're going to understand, now that we spoke about the soul, we're going to be understanding why the 10 Sefirot are called garments, which seem to be something separate, but can somehow have a connection with a person. And as I wrote over here in my notes in English, the parallel of the spiritual realms, God's abilities. So, maybe skip. Antu Hakim, you are smart. This is a continuation of that discourse of Eliyahu. We quoted in the beginning, right in the beginning of discourse, we quoted this line over here, which Eliyahu said, Elijah, that God is one and he has created 10 garments. And he continues and says that God, you are smart. So now we're going to be looking into that. What does it mean God is smart? God is beyond being smart. Wisdom is a human attribute, something which makes us as humans better people, better. So what does it mean that God is smart? So it doesn't mean that God's essence is defined in being smart. That's not what it means. What it means is that God is infinite and has infinite abilities. So his infinite ability expresses in the specific form of wisdom. Now, despite all that, now, even after we said that God is smart, it doesn't mean wisdom the way we humans know wisdom. God is infinite and beyond time and space. It's the source of our ability of being smart. The fact that we humans can sit here in this world and intellectualize and understand things in our brains, that idea was first created by God. To have a question soon, how exactly is an expressed in one specific idea. Infinity has everything in it. Why specifically wisdom? We're going to get to that soon, but for now, let's focus on this. So we called God wise. It doesn't mean that God is wise. What it means is that there is a place, so to speak, within God's infinity where our wisdom as humans comes from, in God's infinity. Now, even though there's an infinite difference, we can completely not compare between God's wisdom to our human wisdom, not even to the angel's wisdom, not even to the soul's wisdom, and definitely not our physical human wisdom here in this physical universe, limited by time and space. But nonetheless, this is where it comes from. And therefore, when we want to speak about God, we understand that our wisdom comes from God, and we say that God must be smart. God has this wisdom within him. Now, we just spoke about one thing, wisdom. Now we're going to be showing how everything in this physical world works exactly in the same way. Everything comes from God's infinite energy and spirituality. This is what I wrote in my notes right here. Spirituality is the source of everything in this physical universe. Now we're going to be seeing that. So everything in this world has a source in God's infinite spirituality. So now let's think about apples. And he actually brings an analogy or a specific case of the apple. Tapuach hagashmi, a physical apple. Yesh benesikus is sweet. B'cheich oichel yitam ha'im noimar. Sheyesh b'keich hatzemech asher ba'oretz hatam ha'mesikus gamkin. Upshitu b'mazel she'enu me'erech u'mehus zeh klal. So now I have a question for you. We just said that an apple is sweet. Where does the sweetness come from? Where does the sweetness come from? It comes from a tree, which comes from the ground. Would you say that the ground is sweet? Obviously, the ground is not sweet. So obviously, the spirituality is not sweet. So where exactly does sweetness come from? Now, we go to the next page, right here, top of the page. Don't want to start typing. I want to highlight. So, where does sweetness comes from? Sweetness comes from the kindness of God. Isn't that interesting? We have the 10 Sefirot. In the 10 Sefirot, we have logic, intellect, and then we have feelings. Within those feelings, we have kindness, we have being strict, how God can be kind to the world, how God can be strict. Now, obviously, the point that we're trying to bring across over here is that God's kindness, this spiritual infinite kindness, is not kindness the way we think of it. It's a spiritual energy, which is the source of our kindness. But the point we're trying to say over here is actually that the sweetness of an apple comes from this attribute of infinite spiritual kindness. And where does bitterness come from? When we eat something bitter, it comes from the spiritual infinite attribute of Gevura. This is the word right here, Gevura, which means to be strict, to be severity. Despite these things being completely spiritual and infinite, but there is an evolution of spiritual levels, and they devolve, and they become less and less spiritual. They become more and more physical, to the so many levels that by the time we get down to this physical world, you can have a physical sweetness of an apple coming from a spiritual infinite energy. And now he gives us an analogy how we can understand how sweetness comes from something spiritual. And it's a very interesting analogy that he gives. He says that we can feel, you can say somebody has a sweet voice. Oh, that's such a sweet song. Oh, wow, you're such a sweet person. What do you mean you're a sweet person? There's no sweet taste there. Oh, because sweet is also an idea. It's a spiritual concept. So when you say that somebody has such a sweet voice, he's so, what does that even mean? It's not sweet. Oh, because really something spiritual can have the concept of sweetness. What it means is that it feels good to the person. It's a good experience. So where does this really come from? This really all comes from the Sefirot of Chesed, God's kindness. It takes many stages. So after a lot of evolution of spiritual worlds, finally we reach the sweetness of an apple and of a voice. And this is what we mean when we say that our wisdom comes from God's wisdom. The same thing is with wisdom. There are many layers of wisdom. There are many layers of spiritual wisdom. Our wisdom, which we have in this physical body, is the last of those layers. And obviously, even just one layer above is something that we can completely not even comprehend. It is something which is not tangible to us. So obviously, after an infinite amount of evolution, of spiritual evolution, we're going to reach God's wisdom, so to speak, which is an expression of an infinite power, which obviously doesn't resemble wisdom in any way, but we call it wisdom because that's where our wisdom comes from. So it's true that one spiritual world's wisdom has nothing in common with the next spiritual world's wisdom. Still, we call it wisdom. It is the source and the core. It is the source and the core for our physical wisdom, which comes later. The source of the source. This is also what Chachma Atzilus is. We're going to be talking about what exactly Atzilus over here. He had here a few of the spiritual worlds. There are 4 spiritual worlds, which we will be talking about shortly. So now he says, we just said how God's expression of wisdom needs to take infinite stages of evolution until it reaches us down here in this world. Well, hey, guess what? For God's infinity to express in wisdom, we say that wisdom, that level of wisdom of God, comes from nowhere. In other words, it comes from God's infinity. And therefore, when you have one specific ability called wisdom that has nothing in common with absolute infinity, and therefore the wisdom of God, so to speak, which we're going to be describing a little better shortly, comes from nowhere. In other words, comes from God's infinity, which is considered nothing. And why is that? Because God's infinity, so to speak, needs to go down. So this is right here. It goes into a parallel from a different story. I don't want to get anyone confused, so we're going to skip that a little for now. Includes, and this is why the 10 Sefirot are called garments, in other words, something external, because true, they are the source of our physical reality, and we see them as God's infinite wisdom, but they are, just like we said by the soul, as probably everyone can recall, we spoke about the soul, there's the essence of the soul, and then there's the abilities of the soul. The soul has the ability of being wise, so too God. God is completely beyond even his own ability of wisdom. He is infinite. Wisdom is something specific. Now let's talk a little bit about the 4 worlds, because it's going to be very connected to this conversation that we just had. Okay, let's jump into, I prepared a little bit of stuff over here to talk about the 10 Sefirot and the 4 worlds. Let's talk right now about the 4 worlds. Right over here. So this is a diagram. I took a screenshot from one of our videos at Kabbalah Demystified, and over here we have a diagram of these 4 worlds. Now, obviously, 4 worlds are not, they're not physical. You can't put them on a diagram. This is just a diagram, just like we use words to describe certain things. I'm using these images to describe what I'm talking about. But what these spiritual worlds really are deeper, infinite dimensions within everything. So if we take a moment and think about how everything in this world is made out of elements, we have wood, we have stone, and if we look deeper down into that, we're going to find atoms, and those atoms are going to be made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons. We look even deeper, we're going to find quarks, and then we're going to find fields. So if we look even deeper, we're going to be finding spirituality, and spirituality is the fabric of all of reality. And just like we had those many layers, we had the atoms, and then we had the quarks, so too in spirituality, there's deeper layers, and we can always keep looking deeper and finding a closer layer, so to speak, to God. Now, Kabbalah speaks about 4 spiritual worlds. These are called Atzilus. Atzilus is the one here on the top. And then as you see, there's a line because there's a very big leap going from this world of Atzilus down to the next one. And why is that? This world of Atzilus, the one in white over here without a red circle around it, you may recall we just spoke about God's wisdom. We spoke about God's kindness. We said that God has these 10 specific abilities to express. God is obviously infinite, and these abilities come from God and are not part of his infinity. But we'll see soon that they actually become one with God's infinity. That discussion happens in this world called Atzilus, the one right over here on the top, the white silhouette of these Sefirot. The one that you see over here on the top right, that one would be called Chachma. That one corresponds to wisdom. Obviously, wisdom does not have a location on the top right of somebody's brain. It's a concept, it's conceptual, and there is a specific reason why some of them are on the right, and there's a specific reason for why these lines exist over here. We actually made a video all about that, which I'll be connecting to you to at the end of this, perhaps. So that discussion happens in this spiritual world of Atzilus. And then from this spiritual world of Atzilus, we come to 3 spiritual worlds called Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. And just like we had a discussion before about the soul has intellect, emotions, and then it has the external abilities of thought, speech, and action. So the first of these spiritual worlds corresponds to intellect. It's a spiritual reality which receives spirituality, infinite spirituality from above it, and it sees it in an objective way. It looks at it how it is for real, what it really is. The second one of these 3 levels is called Yetzirah, which means formation, and that can be corresponded to feelings. When we take this world takes the infinite spirituality and sees what it means to it in a personal way, just like our feelings are how we connect to an idea to us personally, how we relate to the outside world in a personal way, not in an objective way. And then there is finally the one all the way on the bottom, which corresponds to like action, thought, speech, and action, things which are actual. When we take that expression and prepare it and program it to come out and go into the next world. And then those are the 3 spiritual worlds. After this sequence, we have the physical world. And in this physical world, we have all of these 4 spiritual layers. They're just, each one is deeper within the next. That was very short, and we have other videos explaining this, and I'm wondering if anybody has any questions on this, if we should explore this idea anymore, or should we continue back into the script? And it looks like we're going to be getting back into the script now. Let me hit the share screen, share entire screen. Okay. So here we are. So what we have concluded speaking about here is that we said that that top world of Atzilus, in other words, God's wisdom, God's feelings, they are not part of God's essence. God is completely beyond it. They are created, just like we spoke about the soul. We have the essence of the soul, and we have the abilities of the soul. The 10 Sefirot are the specific abilities of God. They are not God himself. God, so to speak, uses them to relate, interact with the world. But it's not like that in the last few words, which we were speaking about, and that was, so these three red worlds are not like that with God. Only this top white one, Atzilus, is the abilities of God, and God becomes one with them, just like we spoke about. The soul has logic and feelings, but those last three levels are external. They are created beings, so to speak, outside of God. Nothing can be outside of God, so we're going to be really discussing exactly how this happens and how this distinction happens. Now we are here in number 3. That's what it means that God is one, and he is not part of the calculation, because God is one beyond the 10 Sefirot, and these 10 Sefirot are the abilities that come from God's infinite power. Because the creation of Chachma, and I'm going to go back to this picture that we had right over here. The creation of Chachma, the first level over here in this world of Atzilus, the ability of God. When God, so to speak, creates this ability to be wise, creates the first iteration of wisdom to come down, it's coming from nothing. It's coming from God's infinity. And when you're something specific and you're coming from infinity, it's as if you're coming from nothing. But it's not like that with these other 3 worlds, where it's not as if you're coming from nothing. Everything is a continuation. It's an evolution. So there's a difference between evolution and creation. And this red line over here is where evolution begins. But this world of Atzilus is a spiritual created being by God. Every single one of these 4 worlds has one of the 10 Sefirot is called Keser. And I have this other diagram right over here, which is slightly different from the one that we just showed you. And I'm wondering if you can see what the difference might be. As you're going to see over here, the top level of the bottom level of these 10 Sefirot, as you can see over here on the left side of the screen with the white Sefirot, we have this red line going straight through the last and final one. If we look at the other side of the screen, we'll notice that that circle, that last circle, is missing over here. Why is it missing? That is because of something that we just read inside. That the top level, the highest level of a world, is really the lowest level of the world that comes before it. When you have a chain, so each one goes into the other one, and then that's how the chain continues. So the same thing, Hishtalshalos, this cosmic evolution of spiritual realm, Hishtalshalos is similar to the word chain, actually, because the lowest level of each one of these spiritual worlds becomes the highest level of the next world. And that's what he says over here. Ki malchus da atzilus nasa keser lebria. The last level, which represents the action of the world of Atzilus. In other words, the ability of action of God. God created these 10 abilities, which are his abilities from his infinity. That's a world called Atzilus. And now these abilities go and create a world. So that last level of the 10 Sefirot corresponds to action, and it becomes the highest level of the next created spiritual world, which is called creation, Bria. And then Malchus de Bria, the last level, the last of the 10 Sefirot in that first spiritual world called Bria, becomes the highest level of the next world called Yetzirah. But the difference between the highest level of the first world, which, if you recall, that first world is the abilities of God, the 10 abilities which come directly from God's infinity. In other words, they're not coming from 10 abilities. The 10 created abilities which come after Atzilus into creation are coming from the first set of 10 Sefirot. But where do the first set of 10 Sefirot come from? Let me repeat that. The second set of 10 Sefirot comes from the first set of 10 Sefirot. But where does the first set of 10 Sefirot come from? They come from the infinity of God. And therefore, they're very different. There's less of a relationship. And that's why there needs to be a tzimtzum. There needs to be a contraction. There needs to be a removal. There needs to be a total leap over here. In order to get from infinity, how do you find something specific? How is that possible? And that's going to be something called the contraction, the removal of God's infinity, which we're going to be speaking at length in the following paragraph in the next page. All this is going to be explaining that. And that is different from the creation of the three spiritual worlds. Well, X those diagrams, okay? That's going to be different from the creation of the three spiritual worlds, which have something called a parsa, just a curtain. So there is something stopping and blocking between the first set of 10 Sefirot and the next set of 10 Sefirot, but it's not as crazy as what's blocking between the first set of 10 Sefirot and God's infinity. In Alter Rebbe and Bria Le'Yitzira, Lema component. There's only a separation, which is going to be a curtain, which we're going to be talking also about at length in this paragraph number 5, which also that next page. We're going to be talking about all this in length. Kihine Erin Seif, Hainu, Vergilu Lihies, Spashos, Visavos, Mocker, Vachayas, for Erin Seif, Sheba Atzmosoi, Hainu Bechina Zush, Yeshbe Earliest, Meridim Spashos House, Vachayas. What is God's infinity? God's infinite ability, spiritual infinite ability, simply refers to God's ability to do everything, which existed way before the world was created. This is what it means that before God created the world, it was just God and his name. In other words, God and his expression. Because what is a name? A name is the way you express, the way something else relates to you. So what is that name of God before anything else was created? It's God's ability to express in an infinite way. So now he gives an analogy from the sun. So the sun gives off light, it radiates light, but then there's also the sun within the light. Right? So true sun light is an expression. It's something which goes out. It's the way you come out of yourself and go to something else and express to something else. But also, imagine you cut the sun in half and you peek inside. Will there not be any light? There obviously every single fabric of the sun, every piece of fabric has light, not infinite, within it. So the same thing is with God. God has the ability to express in every part of his fabric. So we just gave an analogy of God's infinite expression, God's infinite power from the sun and its light. And over here we have some quotes and parallels. We're going to skip that. So there is God. There's God himself, and then there's God's infinite expression, God's infinite ability, which is one with God and was there before the world was created, but is not even God himself. And then God's infinite ability is the one which brings forth the 10 Sefirot, those 10 specific abilities called wisdom, kindness, which are not really wisdom and kindness, they're really just the source of our human wisdom and kindness. Sefirot really are. Now we're going to be talking about the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is the contraction, so to speak, the removal of God's infinite expression to make it possible for specific things to come into reality. V'hinei hatzimtzum haya b'or ein soif, dahainu sheha'or nichlal b'mar. There was a contraction, a removal of God's infinity, which means what? Which means that the light, the infinite expression of God, should no longer express to outwards. It should now just be within God. And God is obviously everywhere, but it just means that there shouldn't be an expression to otherness. That's what this means. Limited worlds cannot receive, understand, comprehend God's infinite light because they're limited. If they would receive God's infinite life and expression, then they would become completely nothing. Imagine infinity would shine upon you and be within you. Imagine I would load you with godly, infinite spiritual energy. Would you still be physical? Is that possible? Can a physical body, which is somewhere within the range of 7 feet and 500 pounds, can that have infinite spiritual energy? Is that possible? We wouldn't be able to exist. Nothing would be able to be physical. Nothing would be able to be measured because it would just be part of an infinite continuum. So for this reason, God, so to speak, removed his infinite spirituality from a theoretical space. And when we say space, obviously we don't mean physical space, we mean conceptual. And this infinite expression of God should no longer express outward outside of God. It should remain within God, just God's infinite ability to express. Instead of going outwards, we're going to skip this parentheses. And that's why this removal of God's infinite spirituality is called an empty space and a void. God created. He will translate himself, so let me read along. So what does it mean that God created this empty space and this void? What it means is that God removed his infinite ability of expression from the space, so to speak, of creation. And that it should remain God's infinite ability and expression only within God, not express outwards. Just like our soul. Now we're going back to the soul for a little bit. When a soul gives life to a body, you can see that the soul is giving life to a body. It's expressing its life, it's expressing its energy to give life to a physical body in that body. So it's true that the soul has the ability to give life to a body before it's giving life to a body. That life which the soul has within itself is a potential light, is within the soul itself. It's not actual, it's not expressing. It's not yet giving life to a body, it's just being a soul unto itself. Now we're going to give another analogy. When a wise man, when somebody is thinking to himself. Let me read that again. So when a wise man is actuating his wisdom, in other words, when he's expressing his wisdom to somebody else, or when he's sitting and thinking by himself, he's sitting and studying something very deep. So at that moment, he is expressing his ability to be wise. He is actualizing his ability to be wise. But at the time when this person is involved in emotional expression, or in a plain conversation with somebody else, or if this person is spacing out and not thinking about anything intellectual. At that time, their wisdom is not expressing. It just remains an ability in their soul. So it's true that you do have the ability to think at that time, but right now it's not expressing. The same applies to the ability of sight. We see with our eyes. Even if we close our eyes, you're still able to see. Your ability of sight is still there. So all these abilities which we have, like walking, seeing, hearing, we have that ability even when it's not being expressed. Are we able to walk when we're sitting on the couch? Yes, we are. We're just not walking right now. We're not expressing that ability to walk. Are we able to think when we're not thinking? I don't know if it's possible to not be thinking, but are we still wise? Even if right now we're not involved in something wise, we still have that ability within our soul. That was all an analogy to understand something about God. This can be understood as an analogy to understanding how God's infinite expression is being hidden within himself to remain his ability but not express. This is called empty space and a void. In terms of revelation, because now there is no revelation. So there's no light. There's no expression of infinity in this space, so to speak. Now there's a very, very big disclaimer over here. And why are we talking about Tzimtzum so much? I pointed out in my notes over here that Tzimtzum is explained at length to clarify that God remains everywhere at all times. Now it is true. And by the way, we have a video coming soon on this whole topic of Tzimtzum. It's a much shorter video, 10-minute video where we explain. There was a little bit of a debate regarding Tzimtzum. That video is going to be coming in about a week and a half, I would say. Now it's true that there is no absolute void. Because God himself is everywhere. So it's true that God's expression might not be everywhere, but God himself is everywhere. So what does it mean? What does it mean that there is an empty space? If we were referring to perhaps how a human being can be wise, but right now they're not actualizing their wisdom, then within that human's expression right now, there's a void. Nobody sees that they're wise. But how can you say that about God? God is everywhere. And this is exactly what he's addressing over here. God remains everywhere. That is true. It's impossible for God to be removed from anywhere and even be hidden. So here, we just named a Kabbalist, the Arizal, which lived in the city of Tzfas many years ago. He was one of the fundamental Kabbalists. He's the one who really explained this concept of Tzimtzum, this concept of God's removal of his infinite expression. So the Arizal used to use the term light when he referred to God and his expression of infinity. Now, since God is hiding his expression of infinity, although he is still there because God is everywhere, therefore he used the term Tzimtzum, which means removal. He removed the revelation, the expression of his infinity. But obviously God remains there. And why did he remove it? In order to create the 10 abilities of wisdom, understanding, kindness, etc. An empty space, so that's why he called this a removal of perception, because God removed his, so to speak, infinite light from being perceived and understood in order for us to be able to reach the 10 Sefirot. עד אחר כמה ירידות והשתלשלות מדרגות הגדולים מקודמים שבבחינת עיניים מוקר בבחינת הכלים לייס אלו שמסעבס חכם לא בחכם הידיעה ואין שאז עשה בבחינת כך יסעבס איזה בחינת לייס מוקר דמוקר לייס לבחינת חכמה. So, we just pointed out a very interesting thing over here, and we're going to be covering it we're not going to spend too much time on explaining this because it is a very deep concept. But we will be discussing it at short. So till now, what we've been saying is, we said that God's infinity creates this first world of Atzilus. So here we just pointed out a very interesting point, and that is that really there are additional levels. And now let me share that screen so we can see exactly what I'm talking about. Share entire screen. This should work. Right over here. And that is this. So over here we have on the bottom half of the screen, we have these 4 worlds, and then we see the human at the bottom, all the way at the bottom. This is what we kind of saw before. But then above that, in this diagram, we see that there is some more. We see that there are additional levels. And these additional levels, so this line that you see right over here under this forbidden logo, that is what I was trying to depict as the Tzimtzum, this removal of God's expression, that God is not showing his expression. We have that line over there to show that that's kind of where it stops. And then there's this concept of God's infinite light coming back as a line, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Then we have these 3 levels right over here. We see that this is the process of the development of the 10 Sefirot. At first, the 10 Sefirot were completely infinite and spiritual. They came as one expression straight out of God. They were not yet 10 separate Sefirot, which were organized and categorized. It's just coming straight out of God's infinity. So they're completely and totally spiritual and infinite. And that is really what we just saw over here a second ago. In this text, he was speaking about these levels. And we're not going to go into depth in that. We have a video which will be released either today or tomorrow, actually, where we discuss this topic more in depth. Now we're going to be talking about something very interesting. That is, till God's infinity, we come to 10 distinct abilities called Sefirot in a world called Atzilus. Now we're how that spiritual process continues, how that spiritual evolution continues. Once we have 10 Sefirot, how do we get the next set of 10 Sefirot and the next set of 10 Sefirot until we finally reach this physical human unit? Are there any questions? Let me peek at my chat. Let's see if we have some questions. You see over here, Mr. Shnaz is asking some questions. Very nice. Spirituality is a creation of God. Thank you for asking. Why can't everything just be infinite expressions of God? Why does it need to be something other? Why can't everything be infinite expressions of God? Why does there need to be something other? That is a very interesting question. Everything which is created in reality is created by God's own desire and reason. We don't understand why God did things in the specific way that he did it, but this is how God created us. God created us as something separate so that we should be able to connect to him. And in order to connect to him, there needs to be something in common. And that's why there is this entire spiritual evolution, which really makes a intermediary, so to speak, which we have an intermediary video. If you want, you can go check that out in our Kabbalah for Beginners playlist, which explains why all these spiritual worlds created. You're asking, where was Atzilus created? That's a very good question. Atzilus was created. Atzilus is God's abilities. So I'll ask you, where are your abilities think about it. Where is God's ability? Where's the soul's ability of thinking? Where's the soul's ability of feeling? Where is it? There's no specific location. It's a spiritual concept. It's an ability that the soul has, that when it expresses in that ability, that's when it is being expressed. And it's in no specific location. It's in a metaphorical spiritual location, just like we can understand. Us as humans have the ability to think, the ability to feel. That was a very good question, I must say. So now let's get back into this right here. So now we're going to be speaking about how this world of Atzilus, in other words, God's abilities, how they brought forth creation. The next set of 10 Sefirot, which is a spiritual level of 10 Sefirot. Achinyan aparsa sheben Atzilus lebriya, kol derech mashal k'moi harav, sheretz lahasber seichel gadol talmidei she'ein, hatalmid yochel lekabloi, v'tzarech lahamshilo b'derech mashal v'chilek mamish l'shleimei, l'shmar chom ish zara, shehi mashal la'nimshal, shemadavar b'aved zara, shehi zara m'dei b'terev, v'chenik l'etz v'zeh, sh'arayam, k'moi shemevi mashal m'dvarim chotim, gashim m'dvarim ha'imdim m'mishleim. So, we are now going to be using the concept of metaphor to explain how we get from the first set of 10 Sefirot to the next set of 10 Sefiros. And that is through the concept of metaphor. Imagine explaining something, a teacher explaining something to a student, and he uses a metaphor. He gives an example. And we did that in this very discourse. Right in the beginning, we gave a metaphor of how things work with the soul. We understood better how things work with the soul through understanding how our physical, how the soul works in our body, in our intellect, in our emotions. And then we understood how the soul works as a soul itself and how the soul has its abilities of intellect and emotion. And then we understood how God's abilities exist within him. That was a metaphor. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is taking one idea and putting it into another idea, because that other idea is something that you can understand. The first idea is something you cannot necessarily understand. But if I'll put this first idea into the second idea, it's going to be easier for you to understand. And this is what's happening between the first set of 10 Sefirot and the second set of 10 Sefirot and the third and the fourth. The first set of 10 Sefirot, so to speak, go into another set of 10 Sefirot, which are able to be received by external beings, by creation. And that first set of 10 Sefirot really exists within the next set of 10 Sefirot, just like a concept exists in a metaphor. And now we're going to be talking about that a little more at length. So you want to teach. When a person uses a metaphor, it's because he wants to teach a certain concept through this metaphor, through this example, through this analogy. But that analogy will, so to speak, cover and stop between the concept which is not receivable to a concept which is receivable. This is what this curtain is. There's this curtain stopping between Atzilus and Bria, the first set of 10 Sefirot and the second set of 10 Sefirot. It's a metaphor which separates and transfers from different ideas which are not infinite spirituality, God's abilities of expression, kindness, and wisdom. The second, from the first set of 10 Sefirot, which are God's 10 Sefirot, so to speak, into the Sefirot, they are they become something which is totally different. It's a creation. There is no ability within creation to receive the infinite godly expression of wisdom on itself. It must come into something else. But through this metaphor, through this curtain, so to speak, it is possible for there to be shining God's wisdom into the next world of creation. This is also why the second set of 10 Sefirot, that next world after Atzilut, that next world after God's abilities, is called creation. Now, creation also means something from nothing. So why is it called something from nothing? We just said that it's really the same thing. We just said that the first set of 10 Sefirot is really the second set of 10 Sefirot, just in a form of a metaphor. Lefishi mibchinas parsa, because it goes through this metaphor. Shihia urshul tulda, because it is secondary. It is born. It is born and created. There is a light of wisdom that is created in the second world from God's light and wisdom. It's something different. The first set of 10 Sefirot is God's wisdom, is God's kindness. And the second set of 10 Sefirot are not God's wisdom and God's kindness. They are the metaphor. They are the explanation of God's wisdom and kindness. And so that is something which is considered a creation. Just like when a teacher teaches something to a student with a metaphor, that metaphor is understood to the student in the student's mind, the way the student understands it on his terms. It's a metaphor and a different concept, and from that he understands what the idea that his teacher wants to teach. This is a new idea which he's learning. So also this world of creation, the first world after Atzilus, the second set of those 10 Sefirot. The first set of the 10 Sefirot is God's abilities. But then God's abilities create another set of 10 Sefirot, which resemble those same abilities. And now he's going to say something very interesting. Now, if you think about it for a second, when the teacher imagines this metaphor, he sees how his idea is in that metaphor and expresses and is shaping every single concept of that metaphor. But to the student, he doesn't see that. The student only sees the metaphor. So it's the same thing with the first set of 10 Sefirot to the next set of 10 Sefirot and onwards. The first set of 10 Sefirot is God's abilities to create. The next set of 10 Sefirot are the way God's ability to create express themselves into otherness. But to God's ability, to God's first set of 10 Sefirot, to God's abilities, it seems as if the second set of Sefirot, the second set of 10 abilities, express exactly the first set of 10 abilities. And he continues to explain over here how a metaphor brings an idea into a separate creation from the teacher to the student. But obviously, that idea which is understood in the metaphor is really that same exact idea which was there in the original idea. And this is exactly how this world of Atzilus works with a parsa, with this curtain between the first set of 10 Sefirot and the second. Now he goes back to the idea of Tzimtzum. So let's talk about for a second what we're talking about here. So here we have kind of the whole cosmic evolution of spiritual realms in a diagram that I created. So obviously everything should be taken with a grain of salt. So here we have this first set of 10 Sefirot right over here. That is, so to speak, God's abilities. Then it goes through this curtain, this metaphorical curtain. Right over here we have this line, and it creates the next set of 10 Sefirot. And we're saying that really it's the same set of 10 Sefirot. It's just like they're within a metaphor. They're in something else. But this first set of 10 Sefirot, which is God's abilities, is completely different from God's infinity. Because God's infinity is infinity. It's not something that we can relate to. It's just completely beyond. The next two paragraphs are actually going to be introducing new concepts, and I'm going to be going through them very quickly, and I'll be referring to we have on this channel to further explain this concept at greater depth. So basically what we just said over here is, we just said that the 10 Sefirot, the 10 abilities of God, are created by God. They're not God himself. Nonetheless, because God's infinite ability connects with them, they become one. So over here, he just spoke about something which we kind of skipped on right over here. He just mentioned this level right over here, this line, so to speak, this limited revelation of godliness that is coming from God's infinity, but he doesn't explain it at length. So we're for you to, if you want to see a bit more about what exactly that is, I kind of pulled out these videos over here so we can show everybody videos to watch to gain clarity on this. So if you watch this is the video of the map. You can watch our Kabbalah for Beginners playlist. This map explains spirituality so easily. It's explained at greater length over here. As you can see, we spoke about that a little bit over here. This revelation of godliness. Now let's get back to what we're talking about. So what is this world of 10 Sefirot? What is this world of 10 Sefirot? This world of 10 Sefirot has within it kalim, vessels. Now, if you want to know the difference between energy and vessels, we also have a video all about that, and that is this one right over here. Kabbalah Decoded with 2 simple words. That's also in the Kabbalah for Beginners playlist, and we speak all about energy and vessels over here, the giver and the receiver relationship with God. It explains that better. Now, what is the metaphor that he uses over here? So basically, these 10 abilities of God have God's infinite energy within it. That is the infinite light within a container. The actual ability of wisdom or kindness is a container. It's a vessel for God's infinite light. And God becomes one with these abilities. In other words, they're considered God's abilities. We shouldn't look at them as if they are something totally separate from God. God becomes one with them because God is one. So imagine us imagining a stone in our mind. Think about a stone in your mind. You have that stone in your mind, and now your mind is one with that imaginary stone. So the same thing is with God's infinite abilities. God's limited abilities. God, so to speak, has these limited abilities in his infinite imagination. And his infinite imagination, so to speak, his infinite ability has these limited abilities within it, and they become one with it. So true, this is not the definition of God. God is not kind. God is not defined by being kind. God is not defined by being wise. God is infinite. But within that infinity, you have these specific limited abilities. And obviously, this metaphor that we just gave of a human being thinking about a stone in their mind is very different from the way it is with God, which is actually infinite. So just like we can think with our human minds about a stone, which is something which is completely separate from us, nonetheless, there is a possibility for a physical idea, for a physical stone to be in your mind. You're thinking about that physical stone, and your mind is connecting with that stone in its own experience, in its own mind. So too, God has the abilities to connect with his abilities and become one and be one with these abilities, even though they are something limited and, so to speak, specific, and they don't represent God's full infinity. Now, this is this is something that we, in our physical minds, cannot imagine. We don't know how to think about this. Now, there's a bunch of codes over here. And now, in number 7, we're going to be talking about the 10 Sefirot. Let me check our live stream to see if there's any questions we need to stop with. Are we spiritual? We have spirituality within us, but our physical bodies are not spiritual. Okay. Let us share this screen again. Share. Reminder, we have this playlist, Kabbalah for Beginners. I would strongly recommend all these ideas that you're talking about right now are explained over here with animations and graphics. We actually have a video coming today or tomorrow, or perhaps in a few days, which will explain these ideas in greater depth. Especially Sefirot. The 10 Sefirot are not going to be covered in detail in this class. He mentions it very shortly, so I would definitely suggest watching our video on the 10 Sefirot, which is this one right over here. So make sure you check it out if you want to see how the details of the Sefirot work. Now let's wrap it up. These 2 paragraphs will explain the 3 emotional Sefirot, and we have our video which explains the 10 Sefirot. So now, Chad arich v'chad katzir v'chad beinani. One of them is long, one of them is short, one of them is intermediate. Hine chesed nikra arich. Kindness is called long, because kindness is something that spreads and goes outwards. Just like water flows and goes from a higher place to a lower place. And the attribute, the Sephira of Gevura, is being strict. And if you really want to understand this in greater detail and have the visuals, I would really recommend checking out our video on this. So the strictness, it holds back the revelation of kindness. So we just explained in short over here another part of that Zohar passage which we quoted in the beginning. And over here, he explains that there is another. So we have kindness, we have being strict, then we have compassion, mercy, which is a balance between kindness and being strict. And this is really all going to be discussed in much greater depth in this video of ours. So I would really recommend checking out our 10 Sefirot videos. Now I would like to look at the live chat to check if we have any questions, any closing questions. And then we will close shop for tonight. Okay, so I see we have a question over here from Mr. Matt. How does the soul remember when it leaves its earthly body? It's a very good question. The soul is completely infinite and not as infinite as God, obviously, depends on which level. Us humans have a problem with memory. There's things we remember, there's things we forget. We're limited. Time passage makes us change. The soul in its essence does not change. The soul knows everything, so to speak, to a certain sense from within itself. The soul's time in the body, as we said in this discourse, we said that which part of the soul goes into the body, which part is in our human expression and part of our human experience. It's the logic of our soul and the feelings of our soul. That's the part of the soul which really gets manipulated and changed, and so to speak, has an effect on memory and on mood within our body. But the soul itself, in its spirituality, which is beyond that, can see everything from above, so to speak. So the soul doesn't necessarily remember leaving the body. It's just part of what the soul is. This is what the soul accomplished. The soul, when it comes down into this world, it accomplishes things for itself when it does good things in this world, and it becomes part of its being. These good things the soul accomplishes in this world become part of its essence and its existence. And this is, I would say, how the soul remembers, so to speak, how it leaves the earthly body. How do we start to connect to the next world? That's a very good question. How do we start to connect to spiritual worlds? We need to start meditating and coming more in tune with our soul. We need to understand that the soul is spiritual and is looking for goodness. We need to start thinking about the goodness in the world before we react to something in a good way or in a bad way. We should think to ourselves for a second, why is this thing bothering me? What would my soul think about this? When we want to be upset about somebody else, when we want to be angry at somebody else, ask ourselves, what would our soul really think about this? Because the soul is really unified with God, and everybody is unified with God, and everything's perfect, beautiful, and pure in that reality. So we need to start thinking about that, and the more we think about that, the more we start connecting with the next worlds. But this part, the practical application of actually connecting to higher spiritual worlds, is something which requires a little more study and a little more individual catered understanding. How does the spiritual Sefirot affect this world? The spiritual Sefirot are like the DNA of this world. They are like the atoms of this world. They are within the atoms of this world. They are the coding of this world. They are the reality of this world. Everything in this world is the Sefirot. That's how the Sefirot affect this world. And we're live now for an hour and a half. Hope you all enjoyed, and we'll keep in touch in the community tab, and we'll see what to do in the future. All right, everyone, take care, and you can share this with anybody who you think you'd be interested in, or the channel in general. Thank you. Take care, everyone.